Okay, so you want to own a sheep farm, a green hillside, a slow moving flock, a border collie working the edges, a barn smelling like hay and lanolin, spring lambs on wobbly legs in the wet grass, a basket of raw fleece by the fireplace, waiting to be spun into something you can wear. It's a good picture. It's an old picture. People have been building this exact fantasy in their heads since before this country had a flag. Sheep look like the gentlest, simplest animal you could possibly build a business around. They eat grass, they grow their own product. All you have to do is show up twice a year, once for lambs, once for wool, and collect. Here's the problem: that fleece by the fireplace is not automatically worth anything. In fact, for a large share of American sheep farms, it is worth less than nothing. Most years, on most flocks, it actually costs more to take the wool off the sheep than the wool sells for once it's off. You are not looking at a byproduct that pays for itself. You are looking at a cost of doing business that arrives disguised as a harvest. So let's be precise about what you're actually buying, because it isn't what it looks like from the road. It is not a wool business. It is a lamb business that is legally and biologically obligated to give itself a haircut every single year. And for most of the American flock, that haircut costs more than the hair is worth. Every number in this video is going to trace back to that one sentence. By the end, you'll understand exactly which kind of flock makes the wool pay for itself, which kind quietly loses money on every fleece, and why almost nobody tells you which one you're buying until you already own it. Let's start with what it actually costs to get into this business, because a starter flock sounds like a weekend project and behaves like a five-figure commitment. There isn't one kind of sheep. There are several, and each one is a different bet on what you're actually selling. Fine wool breeds, Merino, Rambouillet, are built for fiber quality first, running roughly $300 to $1,500 or more per head depending on genetics. Meat breeds like Suffolk run $250 to $800 a head and are bred for growth rate and carcass, not fleece. Hair sheep, Katahdin, Dorfer, run $200 to $1,000 a head and don't grow a shearable fleece at all. They shed on their own, like a dog. Which one you buy quietly decides. Before you've spent $1 on fencing, whether wool is ever going to be a real part of your income or just a chore you inherited along with the animal. And within the wool breeds specifically, there's a second layer of taxonomy that almost nobody outside the industry thinks about at purchase time. Fiber grade. Merino and Rambouillet sit at the fine end, the wool that spinners and high-end mills actually want. Romney, Corriedale, and Targhee sit in the medium range, useful but not prized. Down at the coarse end, you've got most of the meat and dual-purpose breeds, Suffolk, Hampshire, Dorset-type crosses, whose wool is really a genetic side effect of breeding for growth rate and carcass weight, not a fiber anyone was optimizing for. You will not see this distinction on a sheep for sale listing. You'll see a breed name and a price. The fiber grade behind that breed name is doing more work in determining your future wool income than almost anything else you'll decide in year one. A small starter operation, something like 10 ewes, typically runs $6,000 to $20,000 all in once you count the animals. A barn or shelter at $1,000 to $5,000, and fencing at $3,000 to $10,000 for that size flock. And fencing for sheep is not a formality. Coyotes, dogs, and the occasional mountain lion or bobcat treat a standard field fence as a suggestion, so most of that money goes into something predator resistant, woven wire or electric netting, not just something that keeps sheep from wandering into the road. Then there's the land itself. The national average price for pasture land in the US sat at $1,920 an acre in 2025, up $90 over the year before and up 79% since 2011. If you'd rather rent than buy, the national average pasture cash rent is $15.50 an acre, unchanged year over year. That range hides enormous regional spread, the same way it does for cattle ground. But sheep need less acreage per animal than cattle do, which is one of the reasons this business attracts people who don't have ranch-sized capital to begin with. Small acreage, small flock, small dollar entry point. That's the pitch. And it's true, right up until you get to the part nobody puts in the brochure. Here's the cost nobody budgets for, and it has a formula behind it. You cannot shear your own flock economically at small scale, so you hire a shearer, and shearers do not price by the head the way you'd expect. The first 5 sheep on a service call run a flat $100 to $150 total, regardless of how many of those 5 sheep there actually are. Sheep 6 through 15 run $10 to $20 a head. It's only once a flock reaches 25 to 100 or more animals that the rate drops to $5 to $7 a head. Do the arithmetic on a 10U starter flock. That flat minimum, spread across 10 animals, works out to something like $10 to $15 a head, just from the base call fee alone, before you even reach the per head rate for the back half of the flock. A 100U operation pays $5 to $7 a head for the exact same service. Same shearer, same clippers, same 2 minutes per animal. The small flock is paying 3 to 4 times more per sheep, purely because it's small. Scale isn't a nice to have in this business. It's the difference between shearing being a manageable line item and shearing being a loss before the wool even hits the floor. Stack it all together: the flock, the shelter, the fencing, the land access, the first year of shearing and feed before you've sold anything. And a small, serious starter operation is realistically looking at somewhere in the $15,000 to $30,000 range to get to the point where you actually have wool and lambs to sell. That's the entry price. Now let's talk about the part of this business that decides whether any of it was worth it. Here's a question. Picture 2 identical sheep, same size, same age, same 7 pounds of fleece grown over the same 12 months. One of them is worth around $30 in wool. The other is worth about 5. Same amount of wool. Same sheep, more or less. What's different? The answer is a number. Most sheep owners never look up micron count. Wool isn't priced by the pound the way people assume. It's priced by fiber diameter, measured in microns, and the spread is not small. The USDA's own wool loan rate schedule for this year prices a fine fleece under 18.6 microns. The range merino and rambouillet type wool sits in at $4.57 a pound, clean. It prices a coarse fleece, 29 microns and up, which is roughly where a typical Suffolk, Hampshire, or Dorset type meat or crossbred fleece sits, at 75 cents a pound, greasy. Read that again. The exact same average fleece weight, 6.8 pounds according to USDA's most recent count, is worth somewhere around $27 to $31 at the fine end of that scale, and about $5.10 at the coarse end. That's not a small variation. That's a 6-fold difference on the identical amount of raw material, decided entirely by a spec you cannot see standing in the pasture. Here's the structural conclusion, and it's the one thing this whole video is built around. Most American sheep were never bred to sit at the fine end of that scale. They were bred for growth rate, for carcass weight, for lambing percentage, because for the last several decades, that's what actually paid the bills. Coarser wool is largely a side effect of breeding for meat, not a defect anyone chose, which means for a majority of US producers running standard meat or dual purpose genetics, the fleece coming off their sheep every spring is landing near that 75 cent a pound floor, worth a little over $5, against a shearing bill, as we just walked through, that can run $10 to $20 a head on a small flock. You are not looking at thin margins. You are looking at a negative number, on the wool line specifically, before you've accounted for anything else. Wool isn't a product for most of this industry. It's a legally and biologically required haircut that happens to leave you a little poor every time you give it. This is also, quietly, why the industry itself has been changing shape underneath the surface. Since 2011, the auction market in San Angelo, Texas, historically the largest sheep and goat market in the country and the heart of American wool production, has sold more hair sheep, the kind that shed and never need shearing at all, than traditional wool lambs. Predation losses, a shortage of available shearers, and weak wool prices pushed producers who had to rebuild flocks after drought and wildfire toward animals that simply opt out of the wool question entirely. That's not a fringe trend. That's the largest sheep market in America quietly voting, animal by animal, that the wool side of this business isn't worth carrying anymore for most operations. So, if wool is often a loss, what actually keeps a sheep farm's lights on week to week? Let's walk through the grind, because this is where the seasonal calendar and the structural choices start to matter as much as the arithmetic. Sheep breed seasonally and lamb in a tight window, typically late winter into spring, which means your labor and vet costs bunch up hard for about 6 to 8 weeks a year and go quiet the rest of the time. That creates a structural fork familiar to anyone who's run livestock. Do you run a tighter, more intensively managed flock with higher per animal inputs and better survival rates? Or a larger, more extensively grazed flock where you accept higher losses in exchange for lower labor costs per head? Neither answer is wrong, but it changes every number downstream of it, and it changes when your bills actually come due. Feed and hay bills peak hardest in the exact weeks your ewes are also lambing, and your vet costs spike. The two most expensive parts of the year land on top of each other, not spread out evenly like a mortgage payment. Recurring costs run somewhere between $300 and $800 per sheep per year, with feed and grain running $120 to $350, and hay another $100 to $250, depending on how much of the year your pasture can actually feed the flock without supplementation. A separate extension style working estimate puts total annual production cost, all in, at around $125 to $250 a head. These numbers don't agree perfectly because they're measuring slightly different things. And that gap itself is worth noting. Feed alone is a fraction of what it actually costs to keep a ewe alive and productive for a year. On top of feed, budget for basic herd health, vaccinations, deworming, hoof trimming at roughly $5 a head, and for record keeping under the federal Scrapie Identification Program, which requires official ear tags on any animal that changes ownership or leaves the property. The tags themselves are typically supplied at low or no cost through the program, but the compliance habit, the tagging, and the 5 years of records it requires is one more task that has to happen whether or not the wool line is profitable that year. Now, here's the deep cut that catches almost everyone who's read a homesteading guide, but never read the actual research behind it: predator control. Roughly 4% of the entire US sheep and lamb inventory is lost to predators nationally every year. That's about 3% of gross sales gone before you ever get an animal to market, and it accounts for over a third of all death losses in the industry. In Wyoming specifically, the 2024 state loss report found predators responsible for 62% of all sheep and lamb deaths that year, worth $5.1 million, with coyotes alone, just coyotes, responsible for 40% of every death in the state and $3.35 million of that value. So you get a guardian dog. Every homesteading guide tells you to. Here's the part they don't tell you. A 7-year controlled study at the University of California's Hopland Research and Extension Center actually tracked the real cost and the real benefit of livestock guardian dogs under working conditions, not survey conditions. The dogs cost about $400 each to buy and roughly $864 a year each to keep, $654 in food, $210 in vet care. Over those 7 years, the study found the dogs actually produced a net loss of over $13,000, a benefit cost ratio of 0.55. Read that again. The standard, universally recommended fix for predator loss lost money in the actual field study because the terrain and grazing pattern at that research site reduced the dog's effectiveness well below what producers report in surveys. The same study found that if the dogs had hit the 68% effectiveness rate producers self report elsewhere, the ratio flips to 1.41, a real profit. Same dog, same cost, different terrain, completely different financial outcome. The advice isn't wrong. It's just not universal, and almost nobody tells you that going in. One guardian dog can also only realistically watch so much ground. Most operations running open pasture end up needing 2 or 3, which multiplies both the cost and the uncertainty in that ratio at once. Here's the one weird but true digression worth sitting with, because it generalizes to almost every hidden cost in this business. None of this, the micron pricing, the shearer minimums, the guardian dog variants, shows up on a sheep for sale listing or in a homesteading starter guide. It shows up in USDA loan rate schedules, in 7-year university field studies, in state predator loss reports that almost nobody outside the industry reads. The lesson generalizes past sheep completely. The real cost structure of a small agricultural business is almost never in the price tag. It's buried in a formula, a regulation, or a data set that requires you to go looking for it. And the businesses that survive are usually run by the people who went looking rather than the people who just bought the animal. There's also a marketing structure specific to wool worth knowing about before you assume you're stuck selling one fleece at a time to whoever drives by. In several wool producing regions, growers pool their fleeces together through a cooperative wool pool, a scheduled collection event where dozens of small producers combine their clips into a single, much larger lot before selling to a buyer or a processor. State wool growers associations in places like Montana and Pennsylvania, and regional cooperatives in the Pacific Northwest and the Northeast run these pools specifically because buyers pay meaningfully better prices for one large, consistent lot than they'll ever pay for 10 farmers' worth of 5 fleece bags. It doesn't fix coarse wool, being coarse wool, but it can push your price a little further up whatever band your fiber already sits in. And it's one of the few tools available to a small producer that costs nothing but a drive to the collection point. Now let's talk about whether this business, taken as a whole, can actually collapse, because it has at national scale, and the reasons are structural, not personal. In 1966, in a single year, the US wool price fell 40%. By the 1990s, the national sheep flock had shrunk to roughly 10% of its size from the 1940s. Today, the United States produces less than 1% of the world's wool clip, while China, New Zealand, and Australia together account for more than half of it. This wasn't one bad decade, it was two things happening at once. First, synthetic fiber became cheap and reliable enough that mills stopped needing wool the way they once did. Second, and this is the part almost nobody knows the exact date of, the federal government had been propping up the price the entire time. The National Wool Act of 1954 created a permanent incentive payment program that supported wool and mohair prices for 4 decades. It was phased out under a specific piece of legislation, Public Law 103 130, and formally terminated after the 1995 marketing year. For 41 years, American wool had been priced with a federal thumb on the scale. After 1995, it was priced purely on what a mill would actually pay for it, and the arithmetic we just walked through, coarse wool worth pennies more than it costs to shear, is what that market has looked like ever since, without a subsidy standing behind it. The visible result of that repricing was infrastructure disappearing, not just farmers quitting quietly. Mount Jefferson Woolen Mill in Oregon was one of the last nearly fully vertical wool mills left in the country. It could card, spin roving, weave, and dye all under one roof. In the spring of 2001, it simply closed its doors, citing insufficient profitability. Nobody burned it down. No scandal, no fraud. The math connecting what a mill could sell finished wool goods for to what it cost to run a full vertical operation on a shrinking domestic supply of coarse, subsidy free wool simply stopped working. The same way it stops working on a 10 ewe flock trying to cover a shearer's minimum call out fee. So, how does a sheep farm actually make money, in plain mechanical terms, once you accept that wool is not carrying the business? The core engine is lamb. One respected working estimate in the industry puts it simply: on typical costs of around $165 per ewe per year, it takes selling roughly one lamb per ewe just to cover the bills. Not the wool, the lamb. Wool at commodity prices might contribute $14 or $15 a year per ewe toward that number. A meaningful help, but nowhere close to covering it on its own. National lambing rates run around 105 lambs per 100 ewes, meaning in an average year, you are close to that one lamb per ewe break even line by default, with very little room for a bad year to push you under it. Let's put a full year's numbers on a flock size you could actually start with: 50 ewes, fixed and recurring costs at that working estimate of $165. A head run about $8,250 a year, all in feed, hay, basic vet care, shearing, tags, the works. At 105 lambs per 100 ewes, 50 ewes wean roughly 52 lambs. Current feeder lamb prices are running in the neighborhood of $300 to $325 per hundredweight. So call an illustrative round number of $220 for a 70-pound lamb at weaning. 52 lambs at $220 is about $11,440 in lamb revenue. Add wool at the coarse commodity end, 50 sheep at roughly $5 a fleece after the shearing bill eats most of the value. Call it another $250. Net, if you're lucky. Total revenue lands around $11,700 against $8,250 in costs. Net, before your own labor, and before any land payment at all, somewhere around $3,450. That's the whole business on paper in a completely ordinary year on 50 U's. It is not nothing. It is also not a living, which is why almost nobody runs 50 sheep as their sole household income. It's the math behind why this is so often a second income sitting on top of another job, not a replacement for one. That 50U number also shows you the ceiling on the fine wool direct to market upside we mentioned earlier. Swap that same flock to fine wool genetics sold direct to hand spinners at, say, $20 a pound instead of the commodity floor, and that $250 wool line becomes something closer to $6,000 or $7,000 a year, genuinely close to doubling the whole operation's net. But that upside has a hard ceiling of its own. The hand spinning and fibercraft market is small, personal, and slow to absorb volume. It rewards a 50U hobby scale flock beautifully. It cannot absorb the output of a 500U commercial operation at those prices because there simply aren't enough hand spinners to buy that much fleece. Fine wool pays better per pound and worse at scale. Commodity wool pays worse per pound and is the only option once you're big enough that it matters. Now, the two futures. In the optimistic scenario, you've built that fine wool flock, merino or rambouillet genetics, and instead of selling into the commodity clip, you sell raw or washed fleece directly to hand spinners and fiber artists, a market where quality fleece can bring $15 to $40 pound instead of the roughly $1.40 national average. Your predator losses run near or below the national 4% average, and your guardian dogs perform closer to that 68% effectiveness producers report in surveys, rather than the underperforming real world study result. Under those conditions, on a 50U flock, you might realistically net somewhere between $6,000 and $10,000 a year once wool is pulling its real weight alongside the lambs. A genuinely solid return for a part time small acreage operation. In the realistic scenario, two or three completely ordinary things happen instead. Your flock runs typical dual purpose or meat cross genetics, because that's what most starter flocks are built from, and your wool clip lands near that 75 cent a pound floor rather than the fine end of the scale. Your predator losses sit at or slightly above the national average, the way they do for most small operations without dedicated fencing infrastructure, costing you one or two lambs you were counting on. Your guardian dog investment underperforms, the way it did at the actual research site in California, not because you did anything wrong, but because your terrain doesn't match the conditions producer surveys are usually describing. No fire, no scandal. Just a slightly coarser fleece, a slightly higher predator loss, and a slightly underperforming guardian dog, compounding quietly until the wool line on your spreadsheet reads negative. The net for the year slides from that $3,000 baseline towards zero or below, and the whole year's actual income turns out to have come from the handful of lambs you almost didn't notice were doing all of the real work. So, if you do decide to buy a sheep farm, remember what you actually own. You didn't buy a wool farm. You bought a meat business with a grooming bill attached. And the sheep, unlike you, never gets a vote on whether the haircut pays for itself.